The autumn sun hung low over central Texas, casting long golden shadows across the Harrison ranch as James Harrison pushed open the barn door. He'd come to check on the new foal, maybe inspect the tack room before supper. What he found instead stopped him cold in the doorway, his hands still gripping the weathered wood, his breath catching in his throat. There, in the soft light filtering through the barn slats, stood his 16-year-old daughter, Eleanor. Her dark hair had come loose from its braid, falling around her shoulders as she laughed. Actually laughed, a sound he hadn't heard since the telegram arrived 6 months earlier. But it wasn't the laughter that froze him. It was who she was laughing with. 3 men in faded work clothes, marked with the letters PW, stood beside her, their hands gentle on the coat of Harrison's prize quarter horse mare. One held a brush, moving it in slow practice strokes. Another was checking the horse's hooves with the careful attention of someone who understood the animal. The third stood back slightly, watching with intelligent eyes, speaking in accented English that carried across the barn like a forbidden melody. German prisoners, enemy soldiers, men whose countrymen had killed his boy at Normandy, and his daughter was teaching them to ride. James Harrison should have exploded with rage. Every father in Texas would have. Every man who'd lost a son to German bullets would have dragged those prisoners out by their collars and had them removed from his property within the hour. The scene before him was a betrayal of everything the war had taught them to feel, everything the newspapers printed, everything the radio announcers declared with patriotic fervor. But James Harrison didn't move. He stood there, hidden in the shadow of the doorway, and felt something crack open inside his chest, something complicated and painful and utterly unexpected. Because the look on Eleanor's face, the light in her eyes, was the first glimpse of his daughter he'd seen since they'd buried Michael's empty coffin in the family plot. The war had come to Texas not with bombs or invasions, but with absence. It hollowed out communities, taking fathers and sons and brothers, leaving behind women and old men and children to somehow keep the ranches running. The Harrison Ranch, 3,000 acres of prime grazing land in the heart of central Texas, had always been worked by family. James, his 2 sons Michael and Thomas, and Eleanor, who could ride better than both her brothers combined and wasn't afraid to prove it. Then came 1942, and the boys enlisted the same day. Thomas at 19, Michael at 21. James had stood on the porch and watched them drive away in the old Ford truck, dust rising behind them like smoke signals announcing the end of an era. Eleanor had been 14 then, already tall and lean and fierce. She'd cried that night, her sobs carrying through the thin walls of the ranch house, but by morning her eyes were dry and her jaw was set. She'd tried to fill the space her brothers left, worked dawn to dusk, rode fence lines, broke horses, hauled feed. She pushed herself until James worried she'd break. Then came June of 1944, and the telegram that shattered what remained of their world. The Secretary of War desires me to express his deep regret that your son, First Lieutenant Michael Harrison, was killed in action in France. Normandy. The word became a weight they carried. Michael had died on a beach thousands of miles away, shot by men speaking the same language as the prisoners, now standing in their barn. Eleanor had gone silent after that. Not the peaceful quiet of contentment, but the hollow silence of someone whose words had all been used up. She still worked the ranch, still rode, still functioned, but the light had gone out behind her eyes. James watched his daughter become a ghost, moving through days without really living them, and didn't know how to reach her. The labor shortage had become critical by autumn of 1944. James couldn't work the ranch alone, and Eleanor, for all her skill, couldn't replace 2 grown men. Cattle needed moving, fences needed mending, hay needed cutting. The government had been clear: use prisoner labor or watch your ranch fail. Hundreds of ranches across Texas had already made the choice. German prisoners of war, captured in North Africa and Italy, were being assigned to farms and ranches to fill the desperate need for hands. James had resisted. The thought of enemy soldiers on his land, eating at his table, working animals that Michael had helped raise, felt like desecration. These were the men who'd killed his boy. Maybe not these specific men, but their countrymen, their allies, the machine they'd served. But economics won over emotion. The ranch was failing. Bills were piling up. Cattle were going untended. In September of 1944, James Harrison drove to Camp Swift, 30 miles east, and signed the papers that would bring 3 German prisoners to work his land. They arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered in an army truck with a bored private at the wheel. James had expected monsters, or at least fanatics with cold eyes and rigid postures. What he got were 3 thin, tired-looking men who climbed out of the truck bed like they were afraid the Texas ground might burn their feet. The oldest was maybe 35, with wire-rimmed glasses and careful hands. Klaus Müller, the paperwork said. The private told James he'd been a veterinarian in Munich before the war. The second was younger, broad-shouldered with sun-weathered skin that spoke of a life spent outdoors. Heinrich Vogel, a farmer's son from Bavaria. The third was quieter, late 20s, with dark eyes that seemed to take in everything. Otto Schmidt, a schoolteacher from Berlin who'd been drafted into a war he never wanted. James had laid out the rules that first day, speaking. Through the translator the army provided. Work dawn to dusk. Stay in the bunkhouse at night. Don't speak to his daughter. That last rule he'd made clear with a look that needed no translation. For the first 2 weeks, the system worked. The prisoners worked hard. James watched them with suspicion, and Eleanor avoided them entirely. She'd taken to riding out early before anyone else was awake, and coming back late after the prisoners had been locked in the bunkhouse for the night. But proximity on a ranch is inevitable. You can't work 3,000 acres with 6 hands without crossing paths. And horses, James would later realize, are the great equalizers. It started with the chestnut mare, Copper, who'd always been skittish. Eleanor had been working with her for months, trying to gentle her enough for breeding, but the horse remained unpredictable. One afternoon in early October, Eleanor was in the round pen with Copper when the mare spooked, rearing high enough that her hooves flashed dangerously close to Eleanor's head. Klaus had been mending a fence nearby. He'd dropped his tools and moved without thinking, approaching the panicked horse with a soft, steady voice, speaking German words that somehow cut through the mare's fear. James, watching from the house, saw Eleanor's surprise turn to curiosity as the prisoner calmed Copper with the practiced ease of someone who understood animal medicine. After that, the wall began to crack. James didn't see the early conversations. He was busy with ranch business, with bills and cattle prices, and trying to keep the operation afloat. He didn't notice that Eleanor started staying closer to the barn when the prisoners were working. He didn't see the first tentative exchanges, broken English meeting stubborn determination, as Eleanor asked Klaus about his technique with Copper. What James didn't know was that Eleanor had been drowning in grief and isolation. 16 years old, her brother dead, her remaining brother deployed somewhere in the Pacific, no friends for miles because all the boys her age were overseas or working their own family ranches. The prisoners, despite everything they represented, were human contact. And more than that, they understood horses in ways that reminded Eleanor why she'd fallen in love with ranching in the first place. Klaus became her unexpected teacher. His veterinary knowledge was extensive, and he was hungry to share it, to be useful in ways that transcended barbed wire and guard towers. He taught Eleanor how to check teeth for age, how to feel for heat in a tendon, how to recognize colic before it became deadly. He spoke about horses the way other men spoke about family, with reverence and deep affection. Heinrich, the Bavarian farm boy, had a gift for riding that matched Eleanor's own. He'd grown up on horses, worked his family's small holding in the mountains before the Wehrmacht came calling. Eleanor found herself watching the way he sat a horse, the subtle shifts of weight and gentle cues that made the animal respond like they were dancing. He was patient where she was impulsive, calm where she was fierce. Otto, the schoolteacher, was the most surprising. He spoke the best English of the 3, careful and grammatical, and he asked Eleanor questions. What were her plans? What did she dream about? Had she read Steinbeck, London, Twain? For a girl who'd been trapped in silence and grief, Otto's questions were like keys unlocking doors she'd forgotten existed. By late October, Eleanor had begun teaching them advanced riding techniques. It started practically enough. The prisoners needed to ride to check the far pastures, to move cattle, to do the work Michael and Thomas had done. But Eleanor took it further. She showed them barrel racing patterns, cutting horse techniques, the art of reading a cow's movement before it happened. She did it early in the mornings or late in the afternoons, times when her father was occupied elsewhere. They practiced in the smaller training arena behind the main barn, where oak trees blocked the view from the house. Eleanor would demonstrate first, pushing her paint gelding through tight turns and quick stops, then watch as each prisoner tried to replicate her movements. Klaus was cautious but precise. Heinrich was natural, his instincts overriding his overthinking. Otto was determined, approaching riding like a mathematical problem to be solved through careful study. They talked while they worked, at first about horses and cattle and ranch work, then, slowly, about other things. Eleanor learned that Klaus had a daughter named Greta, 6 years old when he'd last seen her, who loved to draw pictures of horses. That Heinrich's family farm had been in his family for 8 generations until British bombs destroyed the barn and scattered the livestock. That Otto had been teaching literature to 14-year-olds when the draft notice came, and he'd watched his students get younger as the war ate through Germany's young men. Eleanor told them about Michael, about how he'd taught her to rope when she was 8, how he'd let her ride his favorite horse when no one was looking, how the last letter he'd sent had been full of plans for what they'd do when he got home. She cried when she told them, the first tears she'd shed in front of anyone since the funeral, and Klaus had looked away respectfully while Heinrich offered her his handkerchief, and Otto said quietly that he was sorry, that this whole war was a sorry thing. The moment that changed everything came on a cool November afternoon. Eleanor had been working with a young gelding, teaching him to respond to leg cues when the horse stumbled in a prairie dog hole. The gelding went down hard, and Eleanor, thrown clear, landed wrong on her shoulder. The 3 prisoners had rushed over, and it was Klaus who'd examined her injury with gentle professional hands, declaring it badly bruised but not broken. Heinrich had helped her to her feet, and Otto had caught the spooked gelding, calming him with soft words. Then Heinrich had made a joke in broken English about Eleanor being tougher than most soldiers he'd known, and she'd laughed. Actually laughed, sharp and surprised and real. The sound had startled all of them, and in the silence that followed, something shifted. They weren't prisoner and captor's daughter anymore. They were 4 people who loved horses, who understood the language of the ranch, who'd found something unexpected in each other's company. After that, the sessions became more frequent, more daring. Eleanor taught them trick riding, standing in the saddle at a canter, vaulting on and off moving horses. They taught her German words for different gaits, for parts of the saddle, for the commands they'd used on farms and cavalry units. The barn became their shared territory, a place where the war felt distant and the grief less suffocating. But Eleanor knew it couldn't last. Every time she heard her father's boots on the porch, every time a truck came up the drive, her heart would pound with the fear of discovery. She knew what her father would think, what the neighbors would say, what it meant in a country at war to befriend enemy soldiers. She knew about Michael's grave, about the gold star in the window, about every reason this was wrong. Yet she couldn't stop. For the first time since the telegram, Eleanor felt alive. She felt like herself. And the 3 men in the barn, despite everything, had become something she hadn't expected to find again. Friends. The ranch hands had noticed, of course. 2 older cowboys who'd been with the Harrisons for years watched the interactions with growing concern. They saw Eleanor slipping to the barn at odd hours, heard the laughter, witnessed the easy camaraderie. One of them, Frank Cooper, finally approached James one evening in early November. "Boss, we need to talk about your daughter and those Germans." James had been in his study, going over accounts that refused to balance no matter how many times he checked them. He'd looked up, tired and irritated. "What about them?" "She's spending time with them, alone, teaching them to ride fancy, talking with them. It ain't right, Mr. Harrison, not with what happened to Michael." James had felt anger flare, hot and immediate, but beneath it, something else, a whisper of doubt. Because if he was honest with himself, he'd noticed changes in Eleanor. She'd started eating again. She smiled occasionally. The ghost had begun to look like his daughter again. But at what cost? That autumn afternoon, when James walked into the barn and saw Eleanor laughing with 3 German prisoners, all of that came crashing together. The grief, the anger, the desperate need to protect his daughter, the undeniable fact that she looked happier than she'd been in months. It froze him in place, his hand on the barn door, watching a scene that would force him to make an impossible choice. Because standing there, seeing his daughter alive again, James Harrison realized something that terrified him. These men, these enemy soldiers, had given Eleanor back something he couldn't. They'd reached her in her grief, pulled her out of the darkness, reminded her that life could still hold joy. And he was going to have to decide what to do about it. The mare Eleanor had been grooming shifted, and Klaus looked up, his eyes meeting James's across the barn. The laughter died instantly. Heinrich's hand froze on the hoof pick. Otto straightened, his expression carefully neutral. Eleanor turned, following their gazes, and her face went pale. "Daddy," she said, and her voice was small, terrified, the voice of a child caught in the worst kind of betrayal. James Harrison stood in the doorway, the weight of dead sons and living daughters heavy on his shoulders, and knew that whatever he did next would define what kind of man he was, what kind of father, what kind of human being. The war had taken so much already. This moment would determine what remained. The silence in the barn stretched like a wire pulled too tight, ready to snap. James Harrison could hear his own heartbeat, the nervous shuffle of the mare's hooves, the distant lowing of cattle in the pasture. Eleanor's face had gone from pale to flushed, her hands gripping the curry comb so hard her knuckles showed white. "Go to the house," James said finally, his voice rough. "Now." Eleanor opened her mouth to protest, then thought better of it. She set down the brush with careful precision, her eyes meeting each of the prisoners' faces in turn. There was something in that look, something protective and defiant, that James recognized because he'd seen it in his own mirror. She walked past him without a word, her shoulder nearly brushing his, and he heard the crack in her breathing that meant tears were coming. James waited until her footsteps faded, before turning his full attention to the three men. They stood in a rough line, unconsciously at attention, waiting for judgment. In the slanted afternoon light, they looked young, too young to be the monsters he'd built in his mind. Klaus's glasses caught the sun, making his eyes unreadable. Heinrich's broad shoulders were tense, prepared for violence. Otto simply looked resigned, as if he'd been expecting this moment and had already accepted whatever came next. "Back to the bunkhouse," James said. "We'll talk tomorrow." They filed past him, giving him wide berth, and James watched them go before turning to look at the space they had occupied. The grooming tools were lined up with military precision. The mare's coat gleamed from careful brushing. A bucket of fresh water sat ready. Everything spoke of care, attention, respect for the work, Michael's work, the work his dead son would never do again. James sank onto a hay bale, suddenly exhausted. The mathematics of the situation pressed down on him with suffocating weight. His son had died in France, killed by German bullets while storming a beach in the largest invasion force ever assembled. Michael Harrison, 21 years old, had bled out on Omaha Beach while men like these three fought to stop him. That was the equation that should have mattered. American son equals German enemy. Grief plus duty multiplied by patriotism equals righteous anger. But another set of numbers kept intruding. 3 prisoners times 12 weeks equaled the only reason his ranch was still functioning. Without their labor, James would have lost cattle, missed harvest deadlines, fallen behind on mortgage payments that were already stretching him thin. The bank didn't care that his sons were at war. The cattle didn't care that his heart was broken. And Eleanor, 16 years old, grieving, drowning in silence and loss, then suddenly, impossibly, alive again, laughing in a barn with enemy soldiers. What was that equation? What was a daughter's smile worth? What price should a father pay to see his child rescued from darkness, even if the rescue came from the most impossible source? James sat in the barn until the sun set, and the evening chill crept in, wrestling with mathematics that had no clean answers. That night, Eleanor didn't come down for supper. James ate alone at the big kitchen table, the silence of the house pressing in on him. 2 empty chairs where his sons used to sit. 1 empty chair at the far end where Mary had presided before the cancer took her 3 years back. Now just James and an empty plate and the ticking of the clock that had been in the Harrison family for 4 generations. He thought about the prisoners in their bunkhouse, wondered what they were eating, what they were talking about. He thought about Eleanor in her room, probably crying, probably hating him. He thought about Michael in the ground in France, forever 21, forever beyond reach. The prisoners had arrived with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the stories they carried. Over the following weeks, in fragments and broken English, those stories had emerged whether James wanted to hear them or not. Ranch hands talked. The translator who'd come those first few days had mentioned details, and James, despite himself, had listened. Klaus Müller had owned a veterinary practice in Munich. He'd treated dogs and cats mostly, occasionally horses for wealthy clients who kept them for show. He'd been drafted in 1942, sent to North Africa as a medic because of his medical training. He'd never fired a shot at an Allied soldier. He'd just tried to keep German boys alive in the desert, patching wounds and fighting infections and watching most of them die anyway. The British had captured him during the collapse in Tunisia, and he'd spent 6 months in a camp in Algeria before being shipped to America. He'd left behind a wife, Anna, and a daughter, Greta, who'd been 4 years old the last time he held her. In his bunk, Klaus kept a single photograph, creased and faded from being handled too often. A blonde woman with a serious smile and a little girl holding a stuffed horse. He'd shown it to one of the ranch hands once, his voice breaking as he explained in halting English that he didn't know if they'd survived the bombing, if his practice still stood, if his daughter still remembered him. Heinrich Vogel's story was simpler and somehow more devastating. 8 generations of Vogels had worked the same farm in Bavaria, a modest holding that raised dairy cows and grew hay in the mountain valleys. Heinrich had been the youngest of 5 brothers, all of whom had been drafted. He'd been 17 when the conscription notice came, barely trained before being thrown into Italy where the Americans captured him in 44. The family farm, he'd learned through Red Cross letters, no longer existed. British bombers had destroyed the barn in a raid meant for a nearby factory. Without shelter for the cows, without hay stores for winter, his aging parents had been forced to sell everything. His 4 brothers were all dead. 2 killed in Russia, 1 in France, 1 of pneumonia in a prisoner camp in England. The 8-generation legacy had ended in smoke and rubble and official letters of regret. Heinrich carried no photographs. He said it hurt less to remember faces in his head where he could control them, make them smile, keep them frozen before the war ruined everything. Otto Schmidt had been a teacher at a gymnasium in Berlin, instructing 14 and 15-year-olds in literature and history. He'd loved his work, loved watching young minds grasp complex ideas, loved the discussions about Goethe and Schiller and what it meant to be civilized. Then came 1943, and even teachers were needed, even 30-year-old men with poor eyesight and no military training. Otto had been sent to Italy with a rifle he barely knew how to fire and orders he didn't believe in. He'd been captured during the Allied advance north, surrendering to an American patrol with relief so profound he'd wept. He'd told the translator that first week that he'd been more afraid of the SS officers in his own unit than of the enemy. That fear of doing something wrong, saying something wrong, having your loyalty questioned, had been more paralyzing than combat. Otto wrote letters he knew wouldn't be delivered, long philosophical treatises to former students about what he was learning in captivity, about America's strange contradiction of violence and kindness, about seeing former enemies as individuals, about whether education could prevent future wars if people just understood each other better. James knew all of this through second-hand accounts and overhead fragments. He'd never spoken directly to the prisoners beyond work orders. He'd maintained the distance that duty and grief required, but now, forced to consider what he'd seen in the barn, those stories pressed against his certainty. These weren't the faceless enemy. They were a father separated from his daughter, a farm boy whose entire heritage had been bombed to dust, a teacher who'd never wanted to fight. The ranch depended on them. That was the brutal economic reality James couldn't ignore. Before the prisoners arrived, he'd been 30 days from foreclosure. The bank manager, apologetic but firm, had explained that patriotism didn't pay mortgages. The cattle market was strong, but only if you could get cattle to market. The hay needed harvesting, but only if you had hands to work. 3 German prisoners had solved those problems. Klaus's veterinary skills had saved 2 breeding cows from infections that would have killed them. Heinrich could work a full day without complaining and had an instinct for cattle that matched James's own. Otto kept meticulous records, tracking feed costs and cattle weights with a precision that helped James make better selling decisions. In 12 weeks, they'd kept the Harrison Ranch afloat. The numbers were undeniable. Without them, James would lose everything his grandfather had built. Was that worth Eleanor's friendship with them? Was survival worth the betrayal of Michael's memory? The mathematics refused to balance. Morning came cold and clear, the November sky scrubbed blue by a north wind. James found Eleanor in the kitchen, making coffee with mechanical precision. Her eyes were red-rimmed but dry. She'd cried herself out during the night. "We need to talk," James said. "Are you sending them away?" Eleanor's voice was flat, carefully empty. "I don't know yet." She turned to face him then, and James saw not his little girl but someone older, someone forged by grief into something harder. "They're my friends, Daddy. They're German soldiers. They're prisoners who never wanted to fight. Klaus is a veterinarian, Heinrich's a farmer, Otto taught school." Eleanor's hands shook as she poured coffee. "They're not the ones who killed Michael. Their countrymen did, and our bombs killed Heinrich's whole family. Our planes destroyed Klaus's city. Does that make us monsters?" The question hung in the air, sharp and dangerous. They didn't ask to be here. They didn't choose this war. But they're here, and they work hard, and they're kind, and they're the only people who've understood what it's like to lose everything. James flinched at that. "You haven't lost everything." "Haven't I?" Eleanor's voice cracked. "Michael's dead. Thomas might die any day. Mama's gone. You're here, but you're not really here. You're just going through motions, keeping the ranch alive, because that's what Harrisons do. Those men in the bunkhouse, they see me. They talk to me like I'm a person, not just someone to protect or manage. They've taught me things, important things." "What things?" James asked, genuinely curious despite his anger. "That grief doesn't make you special, that everyone's suffering in this war, that maybe the only way through it is to stop seeing enemies and start seeing people." Eleanor set down her coffee cup with a sharp click. "Klaus told me about his daughter. She's younger than me. Heinrich cries at night, Daddy. I've heard him. Otto reads books in German and tries to remember what civilization felt like before everything went insane." James wanted to argue, wanted to explain duty and loyalty and all the reasons why befriending the enemy was wrong. But the words wouldn't come. Because Eleanor was right about one thing. He had been going through motions, holding grief at arm's length by focusing on cattle and accounts and survival. The week that followed was the longest of James Harrison's life. He watched Eleanor and the prisoners from a distance, studying interactions he'd been too grief-blind to notice before. He saw Klaus teach his daughter how to treat a sick foal, the patient explanations, the gentle correction when Eleanor rushed. He watched Heinrich work alongside Eleanor to repair a fence damaged in a storm, the easy rhythm of shared labor, the companionable silence of people comfortable with each other. He saw Otto sit with Eleanor during lunch breaks, the two of them talking about books James hadn't known his daughter had read. The schoolteacher treating a 16-year-old ranch girl like an intellectual equal, discussing ideas that had nothing to do with war or horses or loss. And James saw his daughter transformed. The hollow-eyed ghost had been replaced by someone engaged, animated, present. She laughed, she argued, she taught and learned and existed in the world instead of just moving through it. The community's reaction complicated everything. Some neighbors had embraced prisoner labor with pragmatic acceptance. The Martinez Ranch, 5 miles south, used 6 German POWs and had tripled their cotton yield. Old man Thornton, who'd lost 2 sons at Anzio, employed prisoners and defended the choice to anyone who questioned it. "War's being fought by boys dying overseas," he'd said at church. "My boys are dead. These Germans can't bring them back, but they can help me keep what my boys would have wanted kept." Others saw it as unforgivable betrayal. The Peterson family refused to speak to anyone who employed prisoners. Martha Whitmore organized a group of women who sent letters to the War Department complaining about fraternization. The town was divided, accusations flying in both directions. James received a visit from Frank Cooper and 2 other ranch hands on a Thursday afternoon. They stood in his office, hats in hands, looking uncomfortable but determined. "Mr. Harrison, we need to say something," Frank began, "about Eleanor and those Germans." "I'm aware of the situation," James said carefully. "With respect, sir, we don't think you are. It's gone beyond work. She's teaching them trick writing. She eats lunch with them. She talks to them like they're friends, not prisoners." Frank's face reddened. "My nephew died at Normandy. Same places. Michael, I can't stand by and watch a Harrison girl treat the enemy like welcome guests. The other men nodded agreement. James saw it then, the ultimatum forming. Choose sides, enforce distance, or lose the men who'd worked this ranch for decades. I appreciate your concern, James said slowly, but Eleanor's my daughter, and I'll handle this my way. Your way seems to be doing nothing, Frank said bluntly. People are talking, Mr. Harrison, saying you've gone soft, saying the Harrisons have forgotten what the Germans took from this family. James stood, anger finally finding its voice. No one in this county has more right to hate Germans than me. I buried my son 6 months ago, an empty coffin, because there wasn't enough left to send home. So don't you dare tell me I've forgotten. The men shifted uncomfortably. Frank had the grace to look ashamed. We're just worried, boss, about Eleanor's reputation, about what this looks like. After they left, James sat at his desk and put his head in his hands. The mathematics had become impossibly complex. Ranch economics said keep the prisoners. Community pressure said send them away. Eleanor's well-being said one thing. Michael's memory said another. And James Harrison, 53 years old, exhausted and grief-stricken and desperately trying to do right by everyone, had no idea how to solve an equation with no correct answer. That evening, he walked to the barn and stood in the doorway, watching Eleanor work a young Mustang in the round pen. Klaus, Heinrich, and Otto stood at the fence, offering quiet suggestions. The horse, wild just days before, was responding to Eleanor's cues, moving in circles, changing gaits, beginning to trust. James watched his daughter gentle a wild thing through patience and understanding, and something clicked into place. A memory from another war, another time, when he'd been young and certain and full of righteous conviction, when he'd learned, in mud and blood and trenches that stretched across France, that the enemy had the same fears and hopes in humanity as everyone else. He'd forgotten that lesson. Let grief and propaganda rebuild the walls. But Eleanor, 16, and grieving and desperate for connection, had remembered what he'd forgotten. That seeing the humanity in your enemy wasn't betrayal. It was the hardest kind of courage. James Harrison made his decision on a Saturday morning in late November, when the first real cold front of the season pushed down from the north and turned the Texas sky the color of gunmetal. He walked to the barn with purpose, his boots crunching on frost-stiffened grass, his breath visible in the sharp air. He'd spent 3 nights wrestling with impossible mathematics, and somewhere in the sleepless hours before dawn, the equation had finally resolved itself. Eleanor was already in the barn when he arrived, which didn't surprise him. She'd been rising earlier each day, seeking the company of the horses and the 3 men, who understood her grief better than anyone else could. James paused in the doorway, watching the scene he'd interrupted days before, now playing out again with the same easy camaraderie that had stopped his heart. Klaus stood beside the chestnut mare, Copper, his hand gentle on her neck as he explained something about hoof angles and weight distribution. Heinrich was demonstrating a mounting technique, showing Eleanor how to swing into the saddle in one fluid motion that put minimal stress on the horse's back. Otto sat on a hay bale, reading aloud from a book about horse training that Eleanor must have loaned him, his accent making the English words sound formal and precise. They saw James at the same moment. The laughter died. Eleanor's face went pale, then defiant. The 3 prisoners straightened unconsciously into attention, waiting for judgment they clearly expected to be harsh. Heinrich's hands clenched at his sides. Klaus removed his glasses and cleaned them, a nervous gesture James had noticed before. Otto simply closed the book and waited, his dark eyes watchful. The silence stretched. James could feel his daughter's tension, could see the prisoners bracing for punishment or banishment or both. He'd rehearsed what he wanted to say, but now, facing them, the words seemed inadequate. So instead of speaking, James Harrison walked to the hay bale next to Otto and sat down. "Teach me," he said quietly. Eleanor's mouth fell open. Klaus froze, one hand still on Copper's neck. Heinrich looked at Otto as if seeking translation, certain he'd misheard. Otto's eyebrows rose behind his glasses, his expression shifting from resignation to confusion. "Sir," Klaus ventured, his English uncertain. "Whatever you've been teaching my daughter," James said, looking at each of them in turn, "I want to learn it too." "Daddy?" Eleanor's voice was small, disbelieving. James met his daughter's eyes and saw the same question reflected there that he'd been asking himself for days. What changed? What equation finally balanced? How did hatred transform into this moment of impossible grace? The answer lay buried in memories James had spent 26 years trying to forget. He'd been 19 years old in 1917 when America entered the Great War. Young and eager and convinced that glory waited across the Atlantic, he'd shipped out with the American Expeditionary Force, landed in France, full of patriotic fervor and certainty about who the enemy was. The Germans were Huns, monsters, baby killers, everything the posters and newspapers promised. Then came the trenches. James had spent 8 months in mud that sucked at his boots and cold that sank into his bones, and fear that became so constant it transformed into a kind of numbness. He'd killed men. He knew that. His rifle had fired, and across no man's land, German soldiers had fallen. Whether his bullets or someone else's, the mathematics of death didn't really matter. But between the UR's fighting came the strange pauses, the quiet moments when both sides were too exhausted to attack, when soldiers from opposing trenches could hear each other coughing, singing, crying for their mothers in different languages that somehow conveyed the same terror. James remembered the first time he'd heard it, a German voice drifting across the cratered landscape, singing something sad and beautiful. One of the American soldiers, a boy from Milwaukee who spoke German, had translated. It was a folk song about home, about rivers and forests and the girl the singer had left behind. "They're just like us," the boy from Milwaukee had whispered, and James had wanted to argue but couldn't find the words. The truth had come slowly, unwillingly, through 100 small moments of recognition. A German prisoner they'd captured, barely 16, crying for his mother. Letters found on dead soldiers, talking about wives and children, and hoping the war would end soon. An injured German soldier James had found in a shell crater, gut-shot and dying, who'd gripped James's hand with desperate strength and said, "Danke," when James had given him water instead of finishing him off. By the time the armistice came in 1918, James Harrison had learned something the propaganda never acknowledged. The enemy was human. They bled and feared and loved and died just like everyone else. The uniforms were different, the languages were different, but underneath, the basic mathematics of humanity remained constant. He'd come home changed, quieter, carrying that knowledge like a weight. He'd married Mary, built the ranch, raised children, and tried to forget the trenches, tried to forget what he'd learned about the thin line between enemy and friend, between killing and compassion. Then came this war. And Michael's death, and all that old hate had come flooding back. The enemy had killed his son. The Germans were monsters again, not people. The propaganda machine had rebuilt the walls James thought he'd torn down, until Eleanor had forced him to remember. "I fought in the last war," James said finally, his voice carrying across the barn. "France, 1917 and 18. I was 19 years old, barely older than you, Heinrich." The young German's eyes widened slightly at being addressed directly. "I killed men over there," James continued. "German men. I watched friends die beside me, saw things no 19-year-old should see." He paused, gathering words that had been locked away for decades. "But I also learned something. In the trenches, in the mud, when the fighting stopped and everything went quiet, I learned that the men across no man's land were terrified boys just like us. They didn't want to be there any more than we did." Eleanor had moved closer, drawn by a story her father had never told. Klaus's hand had fallen from Copper's neck, his full attention on James. Otto leaned forward slightly, his scholarly face intent. "I forgot that lesson," James admitted. "When Michael died, I let myself forget. It was easier to hate all Germans than to remember that wars are started by governments and old men, not by the boys who die in them." He looked directly at Klaus. "My son died fighting your countrymen. That's a fact I'll carry until I die. But these past days, watching you three with my daughter, I've had to ask myself a hard question. What would Michael want? Would he want me to hate forever? Or would he want his sister to heal?" The silence was absolute. Even the horses seemed to be listening. "Eleanor told me about your families," James said. "Klaus, your daughter, Heinrich, your farm, Otto, your students." He stood, walking to face the three men directly. You didn't choose this war any more than Michael did. You got caught in a machine that ground up millions of boys and spit out corpses and grief. And now you're here, thousands of miles from home, probably wondering if you'll ever see your families again. Klaus's eyes were wet behind his glasses. Heinrich had looked away, jaw clenched against emotion. Otto simply nodded slowly, acknowledging the truth of it. "So I'm making a choice," James said. "I'm choosing to see you as men, not as the enemy. I'm choosing to let my daughter have friends who understand her grief, because they carry the same weight. And I'm asking you to teach me what you know about horses and cattle in this land, because God knows I need all the help I can get to keep this ranch running." Eleanor made a small sound, something between a sob and a laugh. She crossed the barn in 3 quick steps and threw her arms around her father, pressing her face against his shoulder. James held her tight, feeling her shake with relief and surprise and something very much like joy. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you, Daddy." Over Eleanor's shoulder, James saw the 3 Germans struggling with their own emotions. It was Otto who found his voice first. "Mr. Harrison," he said carefully, his English formal and precise, "this is unexpected kindness. We will honor this trust." "I know you will," James said, "because if you don't, if you do anything to hurt my daughter or betray this ranch, I will personally ensure you regret it. Are we clear?" "Perfectly clear," Otto replied, and despite the threat, he was smiling slightly. What followed was the strangest afternoon of James Harrison's life. He sat with 4 people who shouldn't have been able to occupy the same space, separated by war and grief and nationality, and learned about horses from men who'd been his enemies. Klaus walked him through Copper's medical history, explaining the mare's chronic anxiety and the techniques he'd been using to calm her. The veterinarian's knowledge was impressive, detailed in ways that revealed years of study and practice. When Klaus examined Copper's teeth, James saw true expertise, the kind that couldn't be faked. "Your mare has pain here," Klaus said, pointing to the back. "Molars. Sharp edge cuts the cheek when she eats. This makes her nervous, afraid of the bit. Small file, 15 minutes, the problem is solved." James had called 2 veterinarians about Copper's temperament issues. Neither had found the dental problem. This German prisoner, working with limited tools in a barn thousands of miles from his practice, had diagnosed it in minutes. "Can you fix it?" James asked. "With proper tools, yes. I have done this hundreds of times." Klaus's face brightened with professional pride. "You have a file for horse teeth?" They didn't, but James made a note to get one. The relief of having an actual solution to a problem that had plagued the ranch for months was almost overwhelming. Heinrich showed James the technique Eleanor had been learning for mounting without straining the horse's back. The young Bavarian moved with an unself-conscious grace that spoke of a lifetime on horseback, his hands gentle but firm, his voice low and soothing. Watching him work, James saw not an enemy soldier, but a farm boy who belonged on the land the way some people belong to music or art. Otto's contribution was different, but equally valuable. He'd been keeping detailed records of Eleanor's training sessions, noting which techniques worked for which horses, tracking progress and setbacks with academic precision. He showed James a notebook filled with observations, diagrams, and analyses that would have impressed a professional trainer. "Eleanor has natural talent," Otto said, "but talent without structure is often wasted. I try to help her see patterns, understand why some methods work better than others. Teaching is teaching, whether literature or horsemanship." As the afternoon wore into evening, the conversation expanded beyond horses. James asked questions he'd been afraid to ask before. Where exactly in Germany did they come from? What were their lives like before the war? Did they believe in the cause they'd been forced to fight for? The answers came slowly at first, then with increasing honesty. Klaus described Munich before the bombs, the city of art and beer gardens and music, where he'd built his practice 1 dog and cat at a time. He talked about Anna, his wife, who'd been a nurse before Greta was born, about the increasing fear as the Nazis consolidated power, the neighbors who disappeared, the questions that became too dangerous to ask. "I did not join the party," Klaus said quietly. "This made life difficult, but I could not make myself believe. Then the draft came, and there was no choice. Serve or be imprisoned, maybe shot, So I served, but I never killed. I fixed bodies. I tried to save lives, even when the cause was wrong. Heinrich's story was simpler and more common. A farm boy who'd never thought about politics, who'd been happy working the land his family had worked for generations. The war had seemed distant until the conscription officers arrived in his village and took every male between 17 and 45. He'd been trained for 6 weeks and shipped to Italy, where the Americans captured him during a chaotic retreat. He'd surrendered willingly, relieved to be out of the fighting. My brothers were not so lucky, Heinrich said, his English halting but clear. All dead now. Mother and father wrote to say the farm is gone. Everything we built for 200 years, finished. I do not know what waits for me when I go home. Maybe nothing. Otto's transformation from teacher to soldier had been the most reluctant. He described classrooms full of boys being groomed for war, the Hitler Youth indoctrination he was required to support, the gradual suffocation of independent thought. He'd tried to resist in small ways, assigning books the curriculum didn't approve, encouraging critical thinking, asking dangerous questions. Then they drafted even the teachers, Otto said, and I went because refusing meant death, and I am a coward. I chose life over principle. I will live with that shame always. Staying alive isn't cowardice, Eleanor said fiercely. It's survival. Perhaps, Otto replied, but survival without resistance feels like collaboration. The conversation had grown deep, philosophical, the kind of discussion James hadn't had since before Mary died. He found himself debating Otto about duty and conscience, asking Klaus about the ethics of serving an evil cause for good reasons, listening to Heinrich describe a world that had been destroyed while its inhabitants were forced to fight for its destroyers. Night had fallen by the time they finished. James stood, stretching muscles stiff from sitting on hay bales, and looked at the 4 faces around him, his daughter, exhausted but happy. 3 enemy soldiers who'd become something else entirely. Not quite friends, not yet, but no longer prisoners in the way that mattered. Tomorrow we start fresh, James said. Klaus, I want you to treat every animal on this ranch that needs it. Heinrich, you and Eleanor work on breaking that Mustang in the south pasture. Otto, keep those records and help me figure out a better system for tracking cattle sales. We've got work to do, and we're going to do it together. The gratitude on their faces was almost painful to witness, as if being treated as humans rather than enemies was a gift beyond measure. James escorted them back to the bunkhouse himself, something he'd never done before, and stood watching as they disappeared inside. Eleanor appeared at his elbow, slipping her hand into his. "You really meant it," she said. "All of it." "I meant it," James confirmed. "Your brother died fighting a system, not people. These men are victims of that system too. Hating them won't bring Michael back, but maybe treating them with decency will honor what Michael believed he was fighting for. Freedom, justice, the idea that every life has value." "The town won't understand," Eleanor said softly. "No," James agreed. "They won't." The backlash started. Within 48 hours, Frank Cooper quit, taking one of the other ranch hands with him. Martha Whitmore made a scene at Sunday services, loudly proclaiming that the Harrisons had betrayed every American soldier's sacrifice. The Peterson family sent a formal letter severing all business ties. Phone calls came at odd hours, voices angry and sometimes threatening. James Harrison stood firm. When confronted at the feed store by a group of angry ranchers, he met their accusations with calm defiance. "Every one of you uses prisoner labor," James said. "The Martinezes have 6 Germans working cotton. Old man Thornton has 4. But when I treat mine like human beings instead of pack animals, suddenly I'm a traitor? My son died at Normandy. I've buried more grief than most of you will ever carry. Don't you dare question my patriotism." "It's different," someone argued. "You're letting them get close, letting your daughter—" "My daughter is learning that humanity matters more than nationality," James interrupted. "She's learning that the opposite of hate isn't surrender, it's wisdom. If that offends you, I don't know what to tell you." The community remained divided, but James's reputation as a grieving father carried weight. Slowly, grudgingly, some of the anger transformed into uncomfortable acceptance. The Harrisons were doing something strange, maybe wrong, but they'd earned the right to process their grief however they needed. And on the ranch itself, Something remarkable was taking shape. Not friendship exactly, not yet, but a working relationship built on mutual respect and shared purpose. Klaus's veterinary skills saved 3 more animals in the following weeks. Heinrich's horsemanship transformed the training program. Otto's organizational mind brought order to chaos. Eleanor bloomed under the attention and respect, becoming more confident, more herself. And James, watching his daughter heal, knew he'd made the right choice. Even if it cost him every friend he had, even if the whole town turned against him, seeing Eleanor alive again made the mathematics balance perfectly. The war would end eventually. The prisoners would go home. But the lessons learned in a Texas barn about humanity, dignity, and the courage required to see past propaganda, those would last forever. The winter of 1944 brought a cold that settled deep into the Texas soil and stayed there, unusual for a region more accustomed to mild winters and early springs. But the cold seemed fitting somehow, as if the land itself was holding its breath, waiting for the war that consumed the world to finally exhaust itself. On the Harrison Ranch, that winter became the foundation for something no one could have predicted. The transformation happened gradually, built one day at a time through shared labor and quiet conversations. James Harrison found himself working alongside 3 men who'd been his enemies, and discovering that the mathematics of humans' connection defied every equation he'd thought he understood. They started with the stables. The old barn, built by James's grandfather in 1898, had weathered decades of Texas storms but was finally showing its age. Support beams sagged, the roof leaked, and the stalls were cramped for the breeding program James had been trying to develop. For months he'd put off repairs because the cost seemed impossible to manage while keeping the ranch afloat. Klaus had been the one to suggest a solution. "We build new stable," he'd said in his careful English. "Heinrich and I, we know construction. In Germany, every farm boy learns building. Otto can design, make plans. We have time, we have hands, you have materials." James had hesitated. The prisoners were paid 80 cents per day by the government for their labor, tokens they could spend at the camp canteen. Extra work meant no extra pay for them. It felt wrong to accept. "We want to do this," Otto had explained, understanding James's reluctance. "It gives purpose, makes us feel useful, not just captured. And Eleanor has been kind to us. This is how we say thank you." So they'd built. Through December and January, whenever weather permitted, they worked. Heinrich proved to be a master carpenter, his hands sure and steady as he measured, cut, and joined timber. Klaus had an engineer's mind for structural integrity, calculating weight loads and stress points with impressive precision. Otto drew up plans that were works of art, detailed diagrams showing every angle and measurement. Eleanor fetched tools and held boards steady, learning construction techniques alongside everything else. James found himself working with them, hammer in hand, following Heinrich's patient instructions on proper joint construction. The young Bavarian communicated as much through demonstration as words, showing rather than telling, his natural teaching ability emerging despite the language barrier. By February, the new stable stood complete. 12 stalls, each spacious and well-ventilated, with a tack room and a small office space. The structure was sound, beautiful in its simplicity, and had cost a fraction of what hiring professional builders would have required. More than that, it represented something unprecedented. Former enemies building something together, creating rather than destroying. The breeding program became Klaus's passion project. His veterinary expertise transformed James's vague plans into a systematic operation. He examined every mare and stallion on the ranch, identifying the best matches for temperament, conformation, and bloodlines. He taught Eleanor and James how to recognize signs of pregnancy, how to prepare for foaling, how to handle complications that could kill both mare and foal. "In Munich, I mostly see small animals," Klaus explained one evening as they reviewed his breeding charts. "But I study everything. Books on horses, cattle, sheep. I think someday maybe I have farm, work with large animals. Then war comes, and I think I never see animals again except as food for soldiers." "You'll go back to it," James said. "After the war, you'll rebuild your practice." Klaus's expression was haunted. If there is anything to rebuild, if Anna and Greta still live, I have no letters in 8 months. Red Cross says Munich is rubble. I try not to imagine what that means. The not knowing hung over all 3 prisoners like a shadow. Letters from home were erratic, heavily censored, often months out of date. The news that did come through was rarely good. Cities destroyed, families displaced, the entire infrastructure of Germany collapsing under the weight of total war. Yet on the Harrison Ranch, life continued with a strange kind of normalcy. They worked, ate meals together, talked about horses and weather and anything except the war. Eleanor read aloud in the evenings sometimes, books from the ranch's small library. Otto would translate complex passages into simpler English for Klaus and Heinrich, and they'd discuss characters and themes as if they were in a classroom rather than a prison camp thousands of miles from home. The ranch's financial situation stabilized, then improved. Klaus's breeding program produced 3 healthy foals in early spring, valuable animals that would sell well. Otto's organizational systems cut waste and improved efficiency. Heinrich's cattle work was so skilled that James was able to sell at premium prices the animals in better condition than they'd been in years. By April of 1945, the Harrison Ranch had pulled back from the edge of foreclosure. The bank manager, reviewing the accounts, had remarked with surprise that the numbers looked better than they had in 5 years. James knew exactly why. 3 German prisoners had saved his family's legacy through skill, hard work, and dedication that went far beyond what anyone could have demanded. Then came May 8, 1945, and the radio announcement that changed everything. James, Eleanor, Klaus, Heinrich, and Otto were in the barn when the news broke. Someone had brought a radio out from the house and they'd been listening to music while working. The announcement interrupted a song, the broadcaster's voice shaking with emotion as he declared that Germany had surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. The silence that followed was absolute and complicated. Eleanor looked at her father, uncertainty written across her face. Was this moment for celebration, relief? What emotion was appropriate when your enemy had been defeated, but your friends had lost everything? Klaus removed his glasses and cleaned them, a gesture James now recognized as his way of dealing with overwhelming emotion. Heinrich sat down heavily on a hay bale, his face unreadable. Otto stared at the radio as if it had personally betrayed him. "It's over," Otto said finally in German, then repeated in English. "The war is over. Your families," Eleanor said softly. "You can go home. You can find your families." Klaus made a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. "What families? What home? Germany is defeated, destroyed. We go back to rubble and occupation and shame." "You go back to the possibility of rebuilding," James said firmly. "The fighting is done. Whatever comes next, at least there's next. There's tomorrow." "Thomas," Eleanor whispered, realization dawning. "Daddy, Thomas can come home now." James felt the weight of it then, the relief he'd been holding back behind walls of grief and duty. His younger son, fighting somewhere in the Pacific, would survive the European war. The Germans wouldn't kill another Harrison boy. The mathematics of loss had been balanced, not through vengeance, but through survival. They didn't celebrate that night. It felt wrong somehow, with Klaus and Heinrich and Otto facing an uncertain future, with the full scope of Germany's destruction still unknown. Instead, they sat together in the barn, sharing a silence that acknowledged both relief and sorrow, victory and devastation, ending and beginning all at once. The repatriation process began slowly. The military was in no hurry to ship hundreds of thousands of prisoners back to a Germany that could barely feed its own population. Camps remained operational, work assignments continued, but everyone knew it was temporary now. The prisoners would go home eventually, back to whatever remained of the lives they'd left behind. Klaus received a letter in June, the first in nearly a year. Anna and Greta had survived. They were living in a displaced persons camp outside Munich, the city too damaged for habitation, but they were alive. Klaus wept when he read it, his whole body shaking with relief so profound it was almost painful to witness. He showed Eleanor the letter, pointing to a sentence Greta had written in careful child's handwriting. "I remember Fadi. I draw horses for him." "She's 7 now," Klaus said, his voice breaking. 7 years old, and I have missed 3 years of her life. She draws horses for a father she barely remembers. You'll see her soon, Eleanor promised. You'll go home and show her everything you learned here. You'll tell her about Texas and the horses you helped heal. Heinrich's news came later and was far worse. His parents had both died, his father of a heart attack in 44, his mother of pneumonia in the winter of 45. The farm belonged to a distant cousin now, someone Heinrich had met maybe twice in his life. There was nothing for him to return to except a landscape of loss. Maybe I stay here, Heinrich said one evening, half joking, half serious. Maybe America needs German cowboys. James had looked at him thoughtfully. Maybe it does. Otto received no letters at all. Berlin had been devastated, carved up between occupying powers. His school no longer existed. The gymnasium where he taught literature to teenagers had been bombed into rubble in 44. Whether his students had survived, whether his colleagues had made it through, remained unknown. I taught boys about civilization, Otto said bitterly, about Goethe and Schiller and the triumph of human culture. Then I watched civilization eat itself alive. What do I teach now? How do I stand in front of students and pretend that any of it mattered? You teach them that it mattered because you're still here to teach it, James replied. You teach them that culture survives because people like you refuse to let it die. The months stretched on. Summer brought brutal heat, autumn brought relief, and still the prisoners remained. Klaus continued treating animals, Heinrich continued training horses, Otto continued organizing and recording and bringing order to chaos. Eleanor turned 17, then 18, no longer a girl but a young woman shaped by grief and unusual friendships into something remarkable. The goodbyes, when they finally came in early 1946, were devastating. The army arrived with trucks and papers, collecting prisoners from ranches and farms across the region for transport to ships waiting in Houston. Klaus, Heinrich, and Otto had 48 hours' notice. Eleanor cried openly, not caring who saw. She gave Klaus a photograph of Copper, the mare he'd healed, with a note on the back. For Greta, who draws horses. She gave Heinrich a hand-braided rope he'd admired, the kind used by the best ropers in Texas. She gave Otto a book, Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath, inscribed with a message. So you remember that America has stories too. James shook each man's hand, a gesture that had evolved from wary distance to genuine respect. You saved this ranch, he told them. You saved my daughter, I won't forget that. You saved us too, Klaus replied. You reminded us we were human when the world had forgotten. When the truck pulled away, Eleanor stood beside her father and watched until the dust settled and the road was empty. She was crying, and James was crying, and neither of them was ashamed. The letters started arriving 6 months later. Klaus had found Anna and Greta. They were living in 3 rooms in a partially rebuilt apartment building. He was trying to restart his veterinary practice, but supplies were scarce and money worthless. The letter included a drawing from Greta, a horse that looked remarkably like Copper, with Texas written carefully across the top. Eleanor wrote back immediately, starting a correspondence that would last decades. She sent care packages when she could, chocolate and coffee and small luxuries that were worth their weight in gold in post-war Germany. Klaus sent updates, photographs as Greta grew, stories of slowly rebuilding a life from ruins. Heinrich's letter came from a displaced persons camp. He'd returned to find nothing, decided he had no reason to stay, and was applying to immigrate to America. You said maybe America needs German cowboys, he wrote. I hope this is true. I hope there is a place for a man who has lost everything but still knows how to work. James Harrison read that letter 3 times, then wrote to immigration officials he knew through the county agricultural board. He provided character references, offered employment, navigated bureaucracy with determined patience. In 1952, Heinrich Vogel stepped off a ship in Galveston as an immigrant, not a prisoner. James met him at the dock. The young man, no longer quite so young after years in camps and displacement, looked thinner, but still had that same quiet strength. They shook hands, then embraced, and James said, "Welcome home." James helped Heinrich buy land adjacent to the Harrison Ranch, 200 acres that had come up for sale. He co-signed the loan, helped with the down payment, treated it as an investment in the future rather than charity. Heinrich built a small house, started his own modest cattle operation, and became a regular presence at the Harrison table. The community, which had been so divided during the war, slowly came to accept Heinrich. He worked hard, caused no trouble, attended church, and gradually became simply Heinrich the rancher, not Heinrich the former prisoner. Some old-timers never forgave, never forgot, but enough people moved past the war that Heinrich found a place. Otto's letters came from West Germany, where he'd found a teaching position in a new gymnasium being built from the rubble of the old. He wrote about his students, teenagers who'd grown up in war and needed to learn how to live in peace. He wrote about the challenge of teaching German literature in a country trying to reckon with what it had become. His letters were philosophical, searching, full of questions about guilt and responsibility and whether education could prevent future atrocities. Eleanor wrote back with her own questions, and their correspondence became a dialogue about larger themes. What did they owe to the past? How did you honor the dead while building for the living? Could people who'd been enemies become something more, or were they forever marked by the circumstances of their meeting? James Harrison found his own answers by living them. He began speaking at community meetings, at church gatherings, anywhere people would listen. He talked about what he'd learned from 3 German prisoners, about the difference between fighting evil systems and hating individual people, about the courage required to see humanity in unexpected places. My son died fighting a war that needed fighting, James would say. The Nazis had to be stopped, but the men I met, Klaus and Heinrich and Otto, they weren't the Nazis. They were victims of the same system that killed my boy. Hating them wouldn't honor Michael's memory. Treating them with dignity, seeing them as human, that's what Michael died defending. The idea that every life has value. Not everyone agreed. Some called him naive, soft, a traitor to his son's memory. But others listened, considered, and began to question their own certainties. In a community still raw with wartime wounds, James Harrison became an unlikely voice for reconciliation. Eleanor never forgot the lessons learned in that barn. She became a renowned horse trainer, building on Klaus's veterinary knowledge and Heinrich's riding skills to develop methods that were both effective and humane. She traveled across Texas teaching her techniques, and always, always, she told the story of how she learned. From a German veterinarian, a Bavarian farm boy, and a Berlin schoolteacher who'd been prisoners of war and became something far more important. Teachers, friends, bridges across an impossible divide. She never married, though she had suitors. I'm married to the horses, she'd joke, but those who knew her best understood it differently. She'd learned young that love took many forms, that family wasn't always blood, that the most important connections were often the ones that shouldn't have been possible. The barn where it all began still stands on the Harrison Ranch. 3 generations later, it's a historical site, marked with a plaque that tells the story in sanitized official language. But the wood still smells the same, and the light still slants through the slats the way it did that autumn afternoon in 1944 when James Harrison walked in and saw his daughter laughing with 3 men who should have been enemies. Historians now recognize that over 400,000 Axis prisoners were held in the United States during World War II, with approximately 50,000 in Texas alone. The Geneva Convention protections ensured humane treatment, and many American families employed prisoners even while grieving sons lost to war. It was one of the great contradictions of the conflict, enemies working side by side in fields and ranches while their countrymen killed each other overseas. Thousands of those prisoners maintained correspondence with American families after the war. Some returned as immigrants in the 1950s, building new lives in the country that had held them captive. The program had helped address critical labor shortages in American agriculture, but its legacy went deeper. It planted seeds of reconciliation, proved that humanity could survive even in wartime, demonstrated that seeing the person behind the uniform was possible even in humanity's darkest hours. James Harrison's decision that November Day wasn't weakness. It was the hardest kind of strength, The courage to look past propaganda and politics, to honor his son's memory not through hatred, but through the values Michael had died defending. Freedom, justice, the radical idea that every human life has worth, regardless of nationality or circumstance. In choosing compassion over vengeance, in teaching his daughter that enemies could become friends, in helping rebuild the lives of men who'd served the army that killed his son, James Harrison did something revolutionary. He proved that the mathematics of humanity don't follow the simple equations of war, that loss plus grief doesn't have to equal hatred, that the bravest choice is sometimes the gentlest one. The barn still stands, a testament to the impossible friendship forged there. And in its weathered beams and worn floorboards lives a lesson that echoes across generations. That courage sometimes wears the face of kindness, that strength can look like forgiveness, that the hardest battles aren't always fought with weapons, but with the determination to see humanity even in those we're told to hate. James Harrison walked into a barn expecting to enforce the rules of war and walked out having discovered something far more powerful. That love is stronger than propaganda. That connection transcends nationality, that the future belongs not to those who nurse their grievances, but to those brave enough to let them go. In the end, 3 German prisoners and 1 Texas rancher's daughter saved each other in ways that had nothing to do with war and everything to do with being human. And that, perhaps, is the only mathematics that truly matters.